Hello, my name is Shad Griffin. Today I'm going to talk to you about how to make AI ethical and trustworthy. Before I get started, just want you to understand that all opinions and funny jokes, they're all mine. They don't belong to my employer or anybody else. This is my point of view. Okay, AI impacts the lives of real people living real lives. And you're going to run into AI pretty much in all aspects of life. New cars, they come with AI. For example, newer cars have backup cameras with sensors. If they keep you from backing into things like concrete posts. Cars that existed, you know, 10 years ago, they didn't have this AI, so it was a lot easier to run into concrete posts. So this AI is generally beneficial, helps us become safer drivers and not run into concrete posts. Also, when you interact with any big company nowadays, you're going to interact with AI. If you try to contact a company through an app on your phone, typically you're going to be talking, your initial contact is going to be with AI. You're going to be talking to a chatbot. And even when you call, a lot of times they'll ask you why you're calling, and they'll take that your response, convert it to text so a chatbot can understand it, and then direct you to an appropriate location. So it's pretty hard to interact with any big company nowadays without interacting with their AI. AI is used to stimulate your purchasing behavior. It's interwoven in all the advertising you see online. And also online, AI controls the news we see. It also controls the people we interact with on social media. So like it or not, AI is a major part of our life and our world, in the world that we live today. So all of this mushrooming of AI that we've seen in the last 10 years or so, that's really good, right? I mean, as a data scientist, it means job security. But what do those outside of data science think? I just found this online. It was a study done by Pew Research. It was a Pew Research study. And in one of their surveys, less of half of all adults in the U.S. believe AI is a good thing. And there's probably a lot of reasons for that. There's been a lot of movies historically and TV shows coming out of Hollywood where man creates AI and then AI eats man. Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. It's a show that my son and I used to watch when he was younger. When he was 8, we used to watch this. Now he's 13 and he kind of thinks everything is dumb. But when he was 8, we used to watch this show together. And Mac, one of the characters on the show, he said that I was always worried that robots would try to kill me one day. Even got a special provision in my life insurance for death by robot, right? And there's a lot of popular movies like Terminator, The Matrix, and then my personal favorite, Battlestar Galactica. And again, these are all examples of man creates AI, AI kills man. This has influenced a lot of popular culture and the way people think about AI. So I think as data scientists, we really need to think. That's why it's important for us to think of ways how we can make AI more trustworthy and more palatable to people outside of the data science profession. So is my MacBook going to eat me this afternoon? Probably not. I mean, it might. I don't think it's going to try to bite me in the bahonkus, but you never know. But I doubt it. But having said that, even though I don't foresee in the near future that AI is going to kill man, like they did in Battlestar Galactica, in the near future anyway, I think there are some real, well, I know there are some real consequences that are occurring in our world today because of AI. And honestly, a lot of them scare the crap out of me, just being completely honest. So as data scientists, we mold and shape AI. And this is a tremendous power. I mean, this AI, it affects real people living real lives. And I think with this power, there comes a tremendous responsibility. We have to build ethical AI. And like I said, I don't think there's any Terminator robots around the corner, but the stuff that we've created and put out into the world is having a negative impact on some people. So how do you build trustworthy and ethical AI? One, make sure your AI is fair. 2, when appropriate, build AI that is transparent. And it doesn't always have to be transparent, but sometimes it does. And I'll go into details of when it does and when it doesn't. And then 3rd, and this is the more difficult one, I think we have to imagine the externalities of AI and correct the negative externalities that come from the AI we create. And just a second, I'll dive into this one and explain what an externality is and how we can fix it. All right, so building AI that is fair. Fairness just means that the AI treats everybody equally, right? It doesn't show preference to one group of people. It's fair. And the important thing to understand about machine learning models is they're not crystal balls. In a lot of ways, they're just garbage in, garbage out. I mean, they what they do is they look at the historical repository of information, and they learn from that historical repository of information, and then they take that learning and they project it into the current or into the future. So if you have a repository of information that includes racial, gender, or some other kind of discrimination, the AI is not going to know that that's there. It's just going to take that as the way it's supposed to be. So if you have historical discrimination in your historical data, the AI is just going to replicate that, and you're going to repeat that same discrimination. Let me give you an example. Let's say you have 3 ethnic groups in your society: Grovers, Big Birds, and Elmos. Historically, Elmos were considered lower class and were discriminated against, and historically were not able to get mortgage loans. So Big Birds and Grovers were able to get home loans. Elmos were not. Not because they didn't want them or they weren't worthy, just because they were faced discrimination. So if you use a machine learning model and you train it on data with this discrimination backed in, it's going to look at Elmos and see that very few of them have mortgage loans. And it's going to assume that it's because they have they just don't want them. And that when you take that machine learning model and you apply it forward, all your Elmos are going to get a low probability to get a mortgage loan. It's not going to know that there was inherent bias. It's just going to look at that bias it's going to look at that historical data and assume that that bias is what we want to replicate in the future, and it will replicate it in the future. So unless you do something to augment your AI, you're just going to have this self-fulfilling prophecy. Elmos are going to continue to not get mortgage loans, or they're going to continue to get scored lowly in their probability to buy a mortgage loan. So how do you fix this? The only way to fix it, honestly, is by augmenting the AI with some kind of heuristic. And I have a paper actually in my Medium page that actually walks through some of these examples of how you can fix it. But you've got to, take the AI and manually adjust for the fact that Elmos were discriminated against in the past. Another thing about this is you have to be very careful, because you can break the law, right? We have laws against discriminatory practices in lending, for example, in the United States. Number 2, when appropriate, build AI that is transparent. And I said when appropriate because it's not always important to be transparent, but oftentimes it is. So, and again, transparency is just the ability to explain a model in common language so that everyone can understand. I don't like to use the word never and always because I haven't seen every situation. But I will say this: when every model that I've ever built in my tenure as a data scientist, every single time I had to balance the trade-off between transparency and accuracy. And typically, the more transparent a model, the less accurate. And the more accurate a model, the less transparent, right? So whenever you build a model, you have to understand the context of how this model is going to be applied and decide how transparent it needs to be versus how accurate it needs to be. Just a simple example, like if you look at here on the left-hand side of the screen, you have like a simple crosstab. I mean, this is basically as simple as it gets. This could be your independent variable and this could be your dependent variable. And these crosstabs are going to tell you whether or not if someone lives on campus, whether or not that's predictive of their class rank. It's pretty simple, pretty transparent, very easy to understand. Probably not very accurate though. Then over here you have something that if you showed your small children, it would probably scare them. This is deep learning algorithm, and it's very difficult. This is going to be very accurate, but God knows what's driving your prediction. I mean, it's just a tortured mess in here inside of this thing. So it's not very transparent. So again, there's a trade-off between transparency and accuracy. So if you want to build trust in your AI, you need to be as transparent as possible. And sometimes transparency is important, sometimes it's not. How do you know when it's important? It depends on the context, right? Depends on, for example, who is consuming the output. If I walk up to my lawnmower and tell the lawnmower, I say, look, dude, you're getting old, and you might have a propensity model that says you're getting old and you need parts replaced. The lawnmower is not going to care, right? If I walk up to my wife and say the same thing, at a minimum, she's going to want to know why. Could be worse. I could get punched in the nose. I don't think that's a very good idea. But again, the difference between a human being and a lawnmower is very different. Humans typically want to know why things happen. They don't like to be told what to do. A lawnmower doesn't care. You also have to look at whether or not you want to explain or predict. I mean, there's really two different types of problems. Situations where you're trying to explain something, the relationship between something and something else, or you're just trying to predict. You're just trying to make the most accurate prediction you can. And some problems are explanatory by nature, like pricing, right? Pricing, typically trying to understand the relationship between your price and output or revenue. Same thing with advertising effectiveness. How much spending, if you increase spending in outdoor advertising, how much is that going to affect the revenue for the company? So those are explanatory in nature. Sometimes you're just trying to be as accurate as you possibly can, like if you're dealing with lawnmowers, right? You don't really care about explaining anything. You just want to be just as accurate as you possibly can be. You also have to ask yourself, what happens if this prediction is wrong? I mean, I always give the example of a remote control, the batteries in the remote control of my TV and airplane engines, right? If the batteries go out in my remote control, that's annoying. If airplane engines fail when I'm on a plane, people could die, right? So you always have to understand when you're balancing between transparency and accuracy, what the context is. And again, you always want to be as transparent as possible. And given the context, it depends on, how much you need to push it. Okay, number 3, imagine and correct externalities. Okay, this is a little bit more tricky. All right, in economics, we have a concept called externalities. And it's simply a cost or benefit to a third party who's not a participant in the original market. So for example, the example that I learned when I first took economics 30 years ago is like a plant that's operating on that's polluting, a industrial plant that's sitting on a river and pumping pollution into the river and killing everybody. So that pollution is part of their cost structure, but it's not a cost that they directly bear, right? As long as they can pour that pollution into the river, somebody else is having to deal with it. They aren't. And that's usually when the government comes in and says, hey, you can't do that because you're killing all the fish in the river and that sort of thing. So an externality is something that it's a cost. A negative externality is a cost that's borne by somebody other than the firm. And I think what we need to get our heads around when it comes to AI is that many times these AI processes that we build can have negative externalities. That is, they can impact people who are not directly related to the transaction. right? So you can have two people interacting. You can have somebody interacting with AI, and there's actually somebody else that's adversely affected by that interaction. And I think this is happening now. All right, if you look at advertising, this would be right now. Today we have AI-driven advertising. It wasn't always that way, right? I mean, back in the 70s, we had very limited types of advertising. I mean, we had newspaper, billboards, advertising, or yellow pages, TV, radio, but it was all pretty mass. It was a blunt instrument, right? So we were sending it to a pretty broad audience. In the 80s and 90s, we started getting more specific. We started making individual level pitches through direct mail, through email, things like that. And as we've increased the targeting of these ads, what's happened is that a lot of good things have happened, right? I mean, businesses can very effectively target their messaging to very specific peoples, and that's good, right? That helps them, saves them money on their advertising. They don't have to, instead of putting a billboard up and advertising to everybody that drives by it, you can be a lot more targeted in terms of the people that you contact. The downside of that is people with bad intentions can use that same mechanism to do devious things. Things like tear people apart, make people angry, and even influence elections. It's a similar story with news. I mean, at one time, your news came from mass sources. I mean, you had your newspaper, you had your TV, you had Walter Cronkite on TV, you had your local news on Channel 8, WFAA, or whatever. But it was all still it was all broad, right? Everybody was consuming the same news. So that started to fragment, we started to integrate AI, and now it's individualized. So now you go online and you're not getting just news, you're getting the news that an AI algorithm has determined you want to read. In a lot of ways, that's great, right? I mean, it's going to learn that I want to find out stuff about LSU football or basket weaving or whatever. It's going to learn from my preferences and from my previous clicks and give me and tailor that news. The downside of it is that we all have our own little news. We all have our individual news. And we're all kind of living in our own little news bubble. And everybody wants to hear the news. Everybody has their own sources of news, and the news becomes less about informing people and more about confirming pre-existing opinions. You get the news that you want to hear, and sometimes that's not a good thing. And there are other examples as well. I mean, if you've ever dealt with, mental illness, a lot of times you can't separate the individual from the disease. Neither can AI. AI interacting with a teenage girl with anorexia is probably going to feed the anorexia and not the little girl. That's sad. AI the AI on the internet is designed to connect people together with common ideas, and that's great if we're talking about knitting sweaters, or we're talking about fishing, or we're talking about classic literature. But it also has the ability to connect people with very crazy ideas, and a lot of times very dangerous ideas. And you actually have these communities of people with these crazy ideas and content that goes viral, not everywhere, but just in these individual communities. And that can be very dangerous, right, as well. So what do we do about it? Well, one, you can filter the content. If it's a crazy idea, or if it's someone thinks it's causes people to be anorexic, or whatever, you can filter the content. The problem with that is you run into lots of First Amendment issues, right? Free speech. The other thing you can do is you can change the algorithms, and you can theoretically you could dial these algorithms back. The things that makes them dangerous in most of these cases is their specificity to people, their granularness, how specific they are. dial that back a little bit, and you lose a lot of the externalities or the bad things that are coming with these algorithms. Now, that means you can be less targeted in your advertising, and news may not be exactly what you want, but that may be the cost we have to pay to keep these bad things from happening. The specificness of the AI is what makes it so dangerous. For example, a teenage girl with anorexic tendencies, right now she's getting a social media feed that drives her over the edge. There's no reason that social media feed has to be specific to her. For example, it could be specific to girls of a certain age living in a certain area, right? It's less granular. Therefore, you take a lot of the crazy ideas by aggregating. Fake news can literally take somebody who's not extreme and make them extreme. Again, pull this stuff up. Aggregate this stuff so that you have, instead of being, specific to an individual, it's specific to a group of people that aren't by nature have the same preferences. Again, there's cost with that, but it may need to be what we need to do. Same thing with news. And if you think about it in terms of like a time series analysis, the easiest way to remove extremes from a time series is to aggregate, right? Take a moving average. You're going to have a lot less volatility. Same kind of idea here. So, just to sum up, how do we build trustworthy and ethical AI? 1, build AI that's fair. 2, when appropriate, build AI that is transparent. And 3, imagine the externalities of the AI we build and correct the AI with negative externalities. Thanks for your time.